I have been foreman on the Callaway spread for going on 31 years, and in that time I have watched Ren Callaway do a great many things I could not explain to a reasonable man. I watched him birth a calf in a blizzard using nothing but his bare hands and a length of rope he pulled off his own saddle. I watched him sit with a dying horse for 6 hours rather than shoot it early, because he believed the animal had earned the company. I watched him refuse a land offer that would have made him a wealthy man by any standard the territory recognized, because the man making the offer had once underpaid a widow on a fence dispute, and Ren had a memory for that kind of thing. None of those were easy to explain, and I did not try. A man works alongside another man for 3 decades, and he stops needing reasons. But I will admit, even by Ren Callaway's standards, the business of sending for a bride was the hardest thing I ever tried to make sense of. He told me in October of the year before, out by the East Water Trough, while we were fixing a split board on the fence rail. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without preamble, like it was a continuation of a conversation we had been having for some time, when in fact we had not. He said, "Deacon, I'm sending for a wife." I set down my hammer. I looked at him. He was looking at the fence. "All right," I said. "Agency in St. Joseph handles it. One of the Kendrick boys married through them. Worked out. Kendrick's wife is a fine woman," I said, because she was. Ren picked up a nail. "I'll write them in the week." And that was the whole of it. I did not ask why, because I thought I knew. Ren was 44 years old, and he had been alone on this ranch for 8 years since his wife Clara passed, and I do not mean alone the way a man is alone when he lives by himself. I mean alone the way a man is alone when he has been so long without someone to talk to that he has mostly stopped believing he is anything worth saying. It is a particular kind of silence, and I had been watching it settle on him for years, the way frost settles on a field. So slow and gradual that you do not notice until one morning you look out and the whole world has gone white. So I was glad about the letter to St. Joseph. I would not have told him so, because that would have embarrassed us both, but I was glad. He wrote the letter in November. The agency wrote back in December. There was a woman in Missouri, a river town, the letter said, a woman of 32 years named Willa Crane, school-educated, capable with a household, in good health, seeking a situation in the Western Territories following a change of family circumstance. The agency's description ran to 4 careful sentences and managed to say almost nothing at all, which I thought was the agency's way of being honest without being discouraging. Ren read it twice, folded it, and put it in the desk drawer. "Good?" I asked. "Sensible," he said. For Ren Callaway, that was high praise. They exchanged letters through the winter. I know this because the postal rider started leaving more envelopes at the gate, and because I once or twice passed the lamplit window in the evening and saw Ren at the desk writing with a care and slowness he did not normally apply to anything that was not livestock. He did not share the contents with me. I did not ask. But I noticed that he started cutting his hair a little more regularly, and that the parlor, a room that had essentially been used for stacking fence catalogs since Clara died, got cleaned out in April. He moved the catalogs to the barn. He found a rug somewhere. He bought curtains from the dry goods in Harlan, which I thought was a sign of genuine intention, because Ren hated spending money on the dry goods in Harlan. Willa Crane was scheduled to arrive on the noon stage, the 22nd of June. I drove the wagon in myself, because I was not going to miss it, and because Ren, alone with a horse, was a man of total self-possession. But Ren waiting on a depot platform for a woman he had only known by letter was a thing I judged required supervision. He was already there when I pulled in, standing by the depot wall with his hat on and his hands in his pockets, looking at the road in from the east where the stage would come. He had shaved that morning. He was wearing the good shirt. I tied off the team and came to stand beside him and said nothing, because it seemed the right approach. "Stage is on time," he said. Usually is this time of year, I said. Silence. Hot today, I offered. He did not respond to that. 20 minutes later, the stage came in off the eastern road in a cloud of pale dust, and the driver pulled up in front of the depot, and the door opened, and the first person out was a traveling salesman in a striped vest who had no interest in us whatsoever. The second person out was a boy of about 12 with a carpet bag, and the third person out was Willa Crane. I knew it was her immediately, not because I had any description to work from, but because she came out of that stage the way a person comes through a door they have already decided to walk through, not hesitant, not performing ease, just present and forward-moving with a carpet bag in one hand and a hat in the other that she had clearly taken off inside the stage and had not yet gotten back around to putting on. Her hair was dark and coming loose on one side from the travel. Her dress was a sensible blue-gray that had seen better days and did not appear to trouble her. She was taller than I expected. She looked at the depot, then at the street, then at Wren Calloway standing by the wall, and she did not immediately smile, which I thought was interesting. She just looked at him for a moment with the direct steadiness of a woman taking an inventory. Wren looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for what felt like an embarrassingly long time, though by the clock it was probably 4 seconds. Then Willa Crane said, "Mr. Calloway." And Wren said, "Miss Crane." And that was, for a stretch of about 40 seconds, the total extent of the conversation. I came forward and introduced myself and said it was a long ride from Missouri and did she want to sit inside the depot out of the heat before we started back. And she said no, she had been sitting for 3 days. She would rather stand, and asked if there was somewhere she could get water. I got her water from the depot pump, and she drank it without self-consciousness, standing in the shade of the overhang. Wren had retrieved her trunk from the stage boot and was loading it into the wagon bed with the deliberate efficiency he applied to all physical tasks. He did not look up. "He's always like that," she said to me, not quietly. "More or less," I said. She looked at the wagon. "The letters were longer," she said. "He had more time to think about what he wanted to say," I told her. She considered this. "That's either a reasonable explanation or a very generous one." "Probably both," I said. She handed me back the tin cup. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll find out." The ride back to the Calloway spread was 11 miles on a dry summer road, and if you are imagining a scene of gradual warming and tentative conversation between a man and a woman beginning their acquaintance, I will ask you to set that aside. What actually happened was that Willa Crane sat on the wagon bench beside Wren Calloway for 11 miles of High Plains summer, and the two of them exchanged perhaps 9 sentences. I was in the back with the trunk, which gave me an unobstructed view of both of their profiles. She tried once, about 3 miles out of town. She pointed at the grass rolling west and said, "It's bigger than I expected." Wren said, "Gets bigger." She waited. He did not add to this. She tried again at mile 5 when we passed the creek crossing. She asked what it was called. He said Cedar Fork. She asked if it ran year-round. He said mostly. She said where did it come from. He thought for a moment, genuinely consulting his own knowledge the way he did, and said it came off the ridge north of the Bellamy grazing land. She asked if the Bellamys were neighbors. He said the Bellamy land had been sold 8 years ago and was now part of the Calloway spread. She turned to look at him at that. "You expanded." "When the price was right," he said. There was a pause. "How many acres?" 12,000, give or take." Another pause. She looked back at the grass. "You didn't mention that in the letters." "Didn't seem relevant," he said. She stared at him. I watched her decide not to say whatever she had first thought of saying, and then decide on something else. "I told you in my letters that I grew up on a 40-acre river farm." "I remember," he said. "And you didn't think the difference in scale was worth noting." He thought about this with evident sincerity. "I thought you'd see it when you got here," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she faced forward and sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing for the remaining 5 miles. I said nothing either, but I was watching. I have known Ren Calloway for 31 years, and I know the difference between a man who doesn't speak, because he has nothing to say, and a man who doesn't speak, because he has too much and no clear way through it. What I saw on that wagon bench on the ride home was the second kind. He was watching the road the way he watched things he was uncertain about, with a total stillness that was not peace but the opposite of it. And 3 miles from the homestead, while she was looking at the grass to the west, he looked at her for a moment, quickly, the way you check on something you're not sure about, and then looked back at the road. I figured things might be all right eventually. I did not know how long eventually would take. The first week was a study in parallel occupation. Willa Crane moved into the house, into the room Wren had prepared, the one with the east-facing window and the new curtains, and set about learning the geography of the place with a methodical thoroughness that reminded me of the way a good horse learns new ground, not rushing, not shying, but walking every foot of it until nothing is unfamiliar. She found the kitchen's shortcomings on day 2 and rearranged it without asking permission. The rearrangement was sensible. Wren came in the second morning, stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the altered arrangement of pots, and then went and got his coffee without comment. I was at the table and I watched him register the change and make his peace with it in about 4 seconds, which for Wren was almost fast. She asked me on the third day for a tour of the working operation. Not the house, the working operation, the barn, the cattle pens, the farrier setup, the water situation. I took her around. She asked good questions. How many head? What the grazing rotation was? Whether we lost many to weather? How far the north pasture ran? I answered straight because the questions were straight, and at the end she said the operation looked well run. And I said that was because it was, and she nodded like that satisfied something. He runs it himself, she asked. Him and me and 3 hands, I said. Pelham, who's been here 12 years. Garrett, who came on 4 years back. Young Mace, who's been here 1 season. And he does the books. Does everything, I said. Always has. She looked at the barn for a moment. He's not talkative, she said. No, I said. Is it shyness? I considered the question. I wouldn't call it that exactly, I said. Wren's not shy, he just figures most things can wait, and some things he figures are already understood. By who, she asked. By anyone paying attention, I said. She looked at me with the directness she applied to most things. That's a high bar to set for a woman who arrived 6 days ago. It is, I said, but that's the bar. She looked back at the barn. Well, she said, in the tone of a woman filing something away for later, I'll keep paying attention. Wren's own awareness of her was the kind of awareness a man tries to make invisible and generally fails. I noticed it in pieces. He started coming in for meals at the actual hour rather than whenever he happened to finish with the thing he was doing, which had not been his habit for 8 years. He came in one evening, and she was at the table reading. She had brought books, several of them, packed in the trunk beneath her clothes, and he stopped at the doorway the way he sometimes stopped at the door of a room where something unfamiliar was happening. And she looked up and said good evening, and he said it back and then went to wash up. But he did not go straight to bed after supper that night. He sat in the chair by the window and appeared to be looking at some accounts, which he may genuinely have been doing. But I noted that the lamp on the table where she was reading threw more light than the lamp by the window where the accounts were, and he did not move to remedy this. On the 9th day, there was a disagreement. It was about the water pump behind the barn, the secondary pump that drew from the underground cistern rather than the creek. It had been sticking for 6 weeks, and we had been managing around it, which is to say Pelham and Garrett had been hauling water from the creek trough when the pen animals needed it, which was inefficient and everyone knew it. I had told Wren twice and he had said he'd get to it, and hadn't, because there is always something more urgent on a working cattle ranch, and a stuck pump that mostly works is never the most urgent thing. Willa Crane found the stuck pump on the 9th morning, trying to draw water for the kitchen garden she had apparently decided she was going to establish on the south side of the house. She pumped it half a dozen times, felt whatever was wrong with the handle stroke, and then stood looking at it for a moment. I was crossing the yard and I watched her roll up her sleeves, which was not a metaphor. She literally rolled them up, and then go into the barn and come back with a length of wire and a pair of iron tongs from the farrier corner. By the time Wren came out of the north pen an hour later, she had the pump working. He stopped and looked at it. He looked at her. She was washing her hands at the creek trough, and there was grease on her right forearm, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman waiting to see which way something was going to fall. He said, "How?" She said, "The secondary valve was stuck. I freed it." He said, "With what?" She said, "Wire and patience." There was a pause. He looked at the pump, then at her, and there was something in his expression I had not seen there in some time. Not quite surprise. More like the recalibration a man does when he finds out a piece of ground is more solid than he thought. "Pelham's been hauling creek water for 6 weeks, he said. "I know," she said. "I asked him." Another pause. "You should have told me," he said. "I did fix it," she said. "I would have fixed it," he said. "When?" she said. This was, I thought, an extremely fair question. Wren stood looking at the pump for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you for fixing the pump," in the tone of a man who has recognized that he has walked into an argument he is not going to win, and who has decided to exit it by going over the top rather than looking for the door. She blinked at him. "You're welcome," she said. He went back to the north pen. I came over and leaned on the fence rail. "Nice work," I said, by which I meant the pump. "He does that," she said, not with irritation exactly, more with the tone of someone taking a note. "Does what?" I said. "Ends an argument by being unexpectedly gracious," she said. "Makes it very hard to stay irritated at him." "He's had practice," I said. "Clara used to say the same thing." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He doesn't talk about her." "No," I said. "But he still does," she said. And she didn't say anything else about it, just picked up her tongs and went back to the barn to return them, and I stood there thinking that Willa Crane was paying a great deal of attention and understanding what she was looking at. By the 3rd week, the shape of the days had settled into a particular form, which is to say each of them had found where they stood in the hours, and they overlapped at the edges without collision. Wren was up before light and out of the house before she was in the kitchen, and he came in for the noon meal and for supper, and in the evenings there was the hour or two before dark when the day's work was mostly done and the house was lit and she was reading or writing letters back to Missouri and he was at the desk or out on the porch. They talked more than they had on the ride from the depot because the days were providing them with material. There was always something to report: the west fence line, the well level, what Garrett had found in the upper pasture, the progress of her kitchen garden, which was going better than I would have predicted given the thin soil on the south side of the house. But it was the evenings that I watched most carefully. I had no business watching, and I will admit that, but the bunkhouse porch gave me a clear line of sight to the main house's front window, and I have always been a man who notices things. She read aloud sometimes, not to him, or at least not directed at him. She read the way some people do, as though the words need to be heard to be real. I could not hear what she read from the bunkhouse porch, only the sound of it, the cadence of it, rising and falling the way a creek does over smooth rock. And I noticed that on the evenings she read, Wren had a tendency to be on the porch rather than inside, sitting in the porch chair with his coffee going cold in his hand, looking at the dark coming in from the east. Not listening, or at least not admitting to it. Just present, in the vicinity of the sound. I thought about Clara again at those times. Clara had been a reader too. She used to read to Wren in the evenings in the early years, and he had sat by the fire the same way, that total stillness that from the outside looked like inattention, and from the inside I thought was the opposite. When she died, he had given her books to the church in Harlan, because he said he didn't need them taking up the shelf, and I had never once believed that was the reason. He left wildflowers on the table in the third week. I do not know where he found them because it had been a dry summer and wildflowers were not abundant, but he must have found them somewhere out on the range, a small bunch of prairie clover and what I thought was blue flax, tied with a bit of string, left on the kitchen table. Not presented, not mentioned, just there. She did not mention them to him either, which I thought was either tact or a desire not to embarrass him out of the habit. She put them in a jar with water and set them in the window where they caught the morning light, and that was all. On the 28th day, I was counting by then, because I am not a man who can resist a narrative. She asked him at supper about the North Ridge land. She had ridden out that way in the afternoon, she said, because Pelham had mentioned the view was worth the climb. She wanted to know who had run cattle up there before the Callaway spread expanded. He told her. It was the most consecutive sentences I had heard him speak at a meal in 8 years. He told her about the Bellamy family, the old man, his 2 sons, the drought year that had broken them, about why he had wanted that land and what he had done with the grazing rotation since. She listened, asked questions, and he answered them, and the supper cooled slightly in the plates and neither of them appeared to notice. After supper she poured coffee, and he didn't immediately go to the desk. He stayed at the table. She said something about the ridge grass, and whether the rotation left enough for winter grazing, and he disagreed with her reasoning and explained why, and she pushed back with something about what she had seen from the ridge, and he considered it and said all right. The south quarter of the ridge was thinner than the north. She wasn't wrong about that, but the north quarter could carry more weight than the previous owners had understood, because the soil was different above the rock shelf, and he'd learned that in year 3. She asked how, he told her. She asked something else. He told her that too. I went to bed before it was over. In the morning I came to the main house for the early check-in and Wren was already out in the barn, the same as always. But the coffee pot had been made and there were 2 cups on the table, one used, one not, and one of her books was sitting open face down on the table in a way that suggested it had been set down in the middle of something and not picked back up. I did not remark on any of this. I poured myself a coffee from the pot, because I knew it would be good, and it was. Her name, I should tell you, was given to her by a grandmother who had wanted something practical. Willa. It suited her. Everything about her tended toward the practical, the way she dressed, the way she asked questions, the way she organized the kitchen, the way she handled the pump. But there was a quality underneath the practical that I took me longer to name. It wasn't warmth exactly, though she was not unkind. It was more like a serious recognition of things. She looked at the land and she took it seriously. She looked at Wren and she took him seriously. Not admiringly, or at least not only admiringly. Seriously. The way a person takes something seriously when they have decided it is worth the effort of understanding. She had lost her brother 2 springs before. He had been the one running the river farm after their father passed, and when he went a fever fast, the way those things sometimes go, the farm had to be sold because she could not run it alone. She told me this at the creek one afternoon when we were watching Garrett work a young horse, not in a spirit of self-pity, but in the same steady factual tone she used when she was telling me about soil or weather or water. The agency wasn't my first idea, she said. I tried to stay in the river town. There wasn't much there for me. You had family, I said. A cousin, she said. But she had her own situation, and I didn't want to be appended, she said, with a slight dry emphasis on the word that made it clear she had considered this particular fate and found it unacceptable. So you came west, I said. I came west, she said. The letters from Mr. Callaway were straightforward. He said what the situation was. He didn't promise anything he wasn't in a position to promise. She paused. I appreciated that. I thought about Wren writing those letters, sitting at the desk in the lamplight, taking his time. He's not a man who says things he doesn't mean, I said. No, she said, I've gathered that. She watched Garrett run the horse through a turn. It does mean you have to pay attention to what he does mean. You're not bad at that, I said. She looked at me sideways. I'm getting better, she said. I thought she was underselling herself, but I didn't say so. The first frost came early that year. Came in off the northwest on a Thursday night in the first week of September, 2 weeks ahead of any reasonable schedule. And by the time I woke at 5 in the morning, the ground had a rime on it, and the temperature was still dropping. I went straight to the barn and found Wren already there, already saddled, talking to Pelham in the short, rapid sentences he used when something needed doing fast. The problem was the north pasture. We had moved a section of cattle up there 10 days earlier to work through the late grass before the season turned, and the early frost had come with enough cold behind it to be dangerous for young animals if they were out in the open without shelter. The north pasture had a rock break wind wall on the east side that the older animals would find, but the young ones, we had 14 head of young steers up there from the fall calving, might not, and a 14-hour north wind on wet ground at those temperatures would kill a young animal by morning. Pelham and Garrett were getting horses up. Mace was bringing in the loose gear. Wren looked at me and said, "Ride the east fence and drive whatever you find toward the rock break. I'll take the north." I said I would. He turned back to the horse, and then, "I'll take the south quarter." We both turned. Willa Crane was standing at the barn door in her coat and boots, and I could tell by the way she was dressed that she had been up for some time. The coat was buttoned, the boots laced. She was not asking. She was standing the way she stood when she had already decided something and was presenting it as information rather than a question. Wren looked at her. "It'll be cold," he said. "Yes," she said. "The south quarter is rough in the dark," he said. "Rock ledges." "I know," she said. "I rode it last week." He looked at her for a moment in the way he looked at things he was reassessing. Then he said, "Pelham will show you the ledge line before you split." He turned back to the horse. "Take the bay." "She's steady." She went and got the bay. I rode out with Pelham and then split east while he went with Willa toward the south. Wren took the north alone, as he preferred. The cold was sharp and genuine, the kind that finds the gaps in your coat and settles into your hands, and the dark of the north pasture at 5 in the morning is the particular dark of open country without landmarks, just grass and cold air, and the occasional sound of a displaced steer. I found 8 head huddled by the east fence and drove them toward the rock break, which took about an hour in the dark because cattle have their own sense of direction in cold weather, and it does not always align with yours. By the time I had them moving, it was coming on toward 6:30, and there was a pale gray edge on the east horizon. I got back to the rock break wind wall at 7 and found Wren already there with the north section animals, 14 head banked up against the rock face, and he was starting a fire in the lee of the wall with the wood and flint he carried on the saddle. The fire was going by the time I came in. He looked at my 8 and nodded and said nothing, which was the Callaway version of a report accepted. 20 minutes later Pelham came in from the east with 6. We were 1 short from the south quarter, and I looked at Wren and he looked at the south and then back at the fire, and his expression did not change, but I knew what that stillness meant by now. Then we heard the horse on the rock shelf above, and then we heard cattle, more than 1 animal, from the sound of it. And then Willa Crane came down off the south ledge in the gray morning light with 3 young steers moving ahead of her, and the bay picking its way careful and steady between the rocks, and her hair had come loose on one side again from the ride, and her coat had grass on it from somewhere. And she brought those 3 animals right into the windwall's shelter, and they went to the others and settled without a fuss. She pulled up by the fire and looked at the gathered animals, counting. Then she looked at Wren. "Too short," she said. "Pelham found one at the east fence," he said. We're one short from your section." "I know," she said. "One young one won't come down from the shelf ledge. I couldn't move her alone." She looked at Wren. "She's scared, not hurt. She just needs two people." He got on his horse without a word. She turned the bay and went back up the shelf the way she had come, and he went after her. I stood by the fire with Pelham and Garrett, and we all looked at each other. Then we looked at the cattle. Then Garrett said, "She rode the south ledge in the dark," in the tone of a man revising an opinion. "She rode it last week to know it," I said. Garrett nodded slowly. He tended the fire. Wren and Willa came down off the shelf 40 minutes later with the last young steer between them, the animal moving at a walk between their two horses. They brought her into the wind wall, and she went to the others and lay down in the shelter of the rock. And that was all the animals accounted for. By this time, the fire had built up and the sun was coming up in earnest, and it was still cold, but the killing cold had broken with the dawn. Wren got off his horse and tied her and stood at the fire, and Willa got down too and came to the fire and pulled her coat tighter and held her hands out to the warmth. We were all quiet for a bit. That is the quality of that particular kind of morning, the emergency passed, the damage checked, everybody still standing. It produces its own silence that is different from ordinary silence because it has a thing in it that is more like relief than peace. And then Wren Calloway, who is a man of genuinely few words, said 11 of them. He said, "I should have told you about the North Fence run being short-handed this season." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "I had it in my head Pelham would take the South. Should have mentioned it before tonight." "This morning," she said. "This morning," he said. There was a pause. She said, "You should have." He said, "I know it." Another pause, not uncomfortable. The fire cracked. Somewhere in the rock break a steer shifted and settled. She said, "I was awake when the temperature dropped. I checked the sky and looked at the north. I figured it was the north pasture before you got to the barn." He turned and looked at her then. Not the sideways look, not the quick reassessing glance. Directly. "How'd you know it was the north section?" "You talked about the rotation at supper," she said. "I was listening." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the fire. And the thing that came onto his face was something I had not seen on it in a very long time. It was not exactly a smile. It was the thing that comes before a smile in a man who has forgotten how to make the full movement, the corner of the mouth, the slight ease around the eyes, the half-breath that is relief of a kind that has nothing to do with cattle. "You were listening," he said. Not quite a question. More like a man reading back a sentence to make sure he has it right. "I was listening," she said. "I went and checked the cattle. Pelham helped me. We were not needed at the fire for a while. The animals stayed at the rock break through the morning. By noon the frost had lifted enough to move them back down to the lower pasture, where the shelter was better for a sustained cold, and we drove them down easy in the afternoon light. The ride back to the homestead took about 2 hours, and I rode at the back of the herd with Garrett and Mace, and Wren and Willa rode at the point. They talked the whole way. I could not hear what they said, only the occasional shape of it on the cold afternoon air, a question, an answer, something that was nearly a laugh, more of a question. At one point she pointed at something to the north and he turned to look and she was still talking and he was looking at whatever she was pointing at, and then they were both looking at it together, the horses side by side. I do not know what it was. Some feature of the land, probably. It didn't matter. Garrett said, "Huh," from beside me. "Yeah," I said. He didn't say anything else about it. He was a good hand. We got the cattle in by late afternoon, and I went to the bunkhouse and cleaned up and came back to the main house for supper, because Willa had said she would have supper ready, and I was not going to argue with that. Pelham came too. The 5 of us ate together around the kitchen table, which had not happened since the previous Christmas when Wren had made the grudging concession that the hands might as well eat inside in cold weather. The supper was good, a bean and beef stew she had kept going on the back of the stove through the day, the kind of thing that knows how to wait for you. There was bread. Garrett ate 3 pieces of it. Mace looked like a man who had not had a home-cooked meal in some time, which was because he hadn't. Young Mace was 19, and from a family that apparently did not prioritize bread. After, Pelham and Garrett and Mace went back to the bunkhouse. I was helping clear the table, which I had started doing because it seemed like the decent thing, and because it gave me a reason to be in the kitchen a little longer, and Wren was at the stove banking the fire for the night. Willa was washing the bowls. We were working in the easy silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to talk about it. Then Willa said, without turning from the wash basin, "Deacon, give us a minute." I said good night and put on my coat and went out. I stood on the porch for a moment before going down the steps. Not deliberately listening, I want to be clear on that, but the kitchen window was not quite closed against the draft, and I was on the porch, and the night was quiet. She said something I could not make out. He said something back. There was a pause. Then she said, "I haven't unpacked the bottom of the trunk." I did not know what that meant. I went down the steps. I found out the next morning because she told me, partly I think because she wanted to tell someone, and partly because she had figured out by then that I was a man who kept what was said to him. The bottom of the trunk had her brother's things in it. Not much, a watch, his letters, a small carving he had made when they were young, 2 books that had been his. She had packed them at the bottom when she left Missouri because she didn't know what else to do with them and she couldn't leave them. And she hadn't unpacked them because unpacking them felt like settling in a way she wasn't sure she had the right to do yet. Like it was a decision that needed to be made more deliberately than just the passing of days. She had unpacked them the night before, set them on the shelf in her room, the watch and the carving on the shelf, the books alongside her own. He asked why I hadn't done it yet, she said. We were sitting on the porch steps in the morning, and the air was cold but the sun was up, and the frost had withdrawn to the shadows. "What did you tell him?" I said. "The truth," she said, "that I wasn't sure I was staying." I looked at her, and he said, she said, and then she paused for a moment in the way people pause when they are holding something carefully. He said he knew that. He said he'd known it since the ride in from Harlan, that she hadn't settled, and that he didn't think it was fair to push on it, and he'd been waiting. I sat with that for a moment. 31 years, and still the man surprised me. He said he'd been waiting, I said. He said, she said, that if she didn't stay, he understood it and he'd make whatever arrangements were needed, no hard words. But that if she did stay, he wanted to know it was her deciding it, not just inertia and distance. I looked at the land going gold in the morning light. "What did you say?" I said I was unpacking the trunk, she said. I nodded. "And then," she said, "he said he'd like to court her properly if she'd allow it." I looked at her. She was looking at the land. "He said that," I said. "In those words," she said, "near enough." "Court her properly," I said. "Properly," she said. There was the dry quality in her voice that lived just adjacent to a laugh. "He's a particular man." "He is," I said. I told him yes, she said, "obviously." We sat on the steps for a while. The sun came up over the east rim of the world and the frost finished going out of the shadows, and somewhere in the north pasture, one of the young steers called out, and the morning was just the morning, same as always, except that it wasn't. I will not tell you that everything went smooth from there. There was an argument in the second week of October about the kitchen garden. He thought she was overworking a plot that was already done for the season. She thought he was applying cattle logic to kitchen garden logic, and they were both partly right. There was a longer disagreement about the winter supply order in which she turned out to be entirely right about the quantities, and he acknowledged it eventually, in his way, by placing the order for the quantities she had specified without further remark. He put wildflowers on the table twice more in October, and once, coming in from the north fence at dusk with his coat up around his ears and his hands cold. He stopped at the door of the kitchen where she was at the stove and said something to her in a low voice, not meant for me at the table, and she looked at him with her straight, direct look and said something back. And then he went to wash his hands, and supper happened the same as always, but with a quality to the room that was different from what the room had been 2 months earlier. He took her riding on Sunday mornings, starting in mid-October. Not for work, just riding. He showed her the land the way a man shows something he has had alone for a long time and is finally finding words for. The North Ridge she had already found, and the East Creek, and the South Quarter she knew from the morning of the frost. But there was a place in the Northwest, up past where the grazing land thinned to scrubgrass country, and the rock faces came down in long pale shelves, where you could see the full spread of the Callaway Range laid out below you from horizon to horizon, the grass going gold in the fall light, the homestead a tiny dark square 12 miles south. He took her there in the 3rd week of October, and I know this because Mace saw them go, and Pelham saw them come back an hour before dark. And Pelham said she had a quality about her when she came back that he could only describe as a woman who has seen something she was not expecting to see, and has decided she is glad about it. I asked Wren about it later, obliquely, the way you ask Wren things when you want an actual answer sideways, with another thing in front of it. Good riding up in the Northwest this time of year, I said. He said, That Northwest overlook is something, I said. Haven't been up there in years myself. He was working a piece of tack. He didn't look up, he said. She said she didn't know country could be that big. What did you say? I said. He was quiet for a moment, working the leather. Then he said, I told her it was hers to learn. I went back to what I was doing and didn't say anything else about it, because there wasn't anything else to say. The formal arrangements, the legal ones, the ones the county recognized, were done in November, when the circuit judge came through Harlan on his autumn round. It was not a large ceremony. It was me and Pelham and the judge's clerk and the widow Mercer from the dry goods who served as a witness, and it was done in about 20 minutes in the front room of the Harlan County building. Willa wore the blue-gray dress from the day she arrived, which she had mended along one seam and pressed. Wren wore the good shirt and his one good coat, and had shaved that morning, the same as the day at the depot, except that this time when she came into the room he looked at her and did not look away. She said her words clearly and without hesitation. He said his more slowly, because he did not say important things fast, but he said all of them. On the way home in the wagon it was cold, the sky coming up heavy from the northwest with what felt like the first real snow of the season. She was sitting close enough to him on the bench that I could see the warmth of it. He had his coat on and she had her wool wrap, and he had, at some point between Harlan and the ranch boundary, put the reins in his left hand and put his right hand over hers where they were folded in her lap. She had turned her hand over so the grip went both ways. Nobody said anything on the ride home, either. I sat in the back with the trunk, the same trunk from the depot, though it had been unpacked for 2 months now, and we were using it to bring back some supplies from Harlan. I watched the sky come in from the northwest, and the land run out in all directions under the gray weight of the coming snow, and I thought about the ride out in June with the trunk full and the dust coming off the summer road, and then I thought about now. Pelham once asked me why I stayed so long on a ranch I didn't own. I told him it was the land and the work, which was true, and the wages, which were fair, and the fact that I had been here long enough that leaving would be like pulling out a fence post you'd put in before the ground remembered what it was like without it. All of that was true. But there is another thing I have never said to Pelham, because Pelham is a good hand and not a man for this kind of conversation, and it is this. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a good man learn something he needed to learn for a long time. A man can do 1,000 things right in his life, run a ranch clean, work his land fair, stand by his word, care for his animals, treat the people under him with the decency they're owed, and still have one thing left to learn. For Wren Calloway it was this: that silence is a gift you can give to country, and that country will hold it and give it back. But with a person, silence is a door you need to learn to open sometimes and leave open and see who comes through. Willa Crane came through. She came through in a blue-gray dress with her hair coming loose on one side and a carpet bag and the whole bottom of a trunk she hadn't unpacked, and she paid attention to what she was looking at, and she fixed the pump, and she rode the south ledge in the dark, and she read aloud in the evenings until a man who had stopped listening to things started listening again. And when the man finally asked her, in his particular way, whether she was staying, she unpacked the trunk. The snow came in that evening, the first real snow of the season, coming down soft and steady by the time we got back to the ranch and put the horses up. Wren carried the supplies in from the wagon and Willa put on the kettle, and Mace got the bunkhouse fire going and Garrett and Pelham, and I sat around it and listened to the snow settle on the roof and the ground outside, covering everything clean. And in the main house, the lamp in the kitchen window was lit, and the lamp in the parlor, and there were two shapes moving in the kitchen, the way two people move in a kitchen when they have learned each other's rhythms enough not to collide. I had a coffee and I sat with my hands around it and looked at the light in the main house window, and I thought, there it is, after 8 years of frost. There it is.